Number 8. The moral failure lie. Here's a weird historical fact. In the 1950s, ADHD wasn't a diagnosis. It was called minimal brain dysfunction. Translation: if you couldn't sit still or focus, you were basically labeled defective. For decades, kids who had ADHD symptoms were told they were just troublemakers. Schools framed it as a discipline issue. Why can't you behave? Parents were told to punish harder. And if you carried that struggle into adulthood, you were just immature or irresponsible. The assumption was that difficulty focusing was a character flaw, something you should be ashamed of. The truth? ADHD is neurological, not moral. Research from the 1970s onward began showing clear patterns in brain development, dopamine regulation, and working memory deficits. But the moral failure narrative stuck around, reinforced by culture. Even now, adults internalize this. If you miss deadlines or forget bills, it feels like evidence you're bad. But shame doesn't fix executive dysfunction, it makes it worse. Psychologists have found that punishment-based approaches actually increase avoidance behaviors in ADHD adults. So the entire cultural script, that you're failing because you don't try hard enough, was never just wrong, it was actively harmful. ADHD isn't about morality, it's about wiring. Which raises the next uncomfortable truth: whose wiring did society decide to value in the first place? Number 7. The gender blind spot. Did you know that for decades, ADHD was considered a boys' disorder? Girls were basically invisible in the data. If you weren't bouncing off the walls, researchers didn't think you existed. The stereotype was always the hyperactive boy disrupting class. Meanwhile, girls who daydreamed, forgot homework, or struggled quietly were just called spacey or scatterbrained. Teachers didn't see it, doctors didn't test for it, and generations of women were left thinking they were just bad at life. The damage from that invisibility is still unfolding today. Studies show that girls with ADHD are far more likely to present with inattentiveness rather than hyperactivity. But because the diagnostic criteria were built around disruptive male behaviors, women went undiagnosed for decades. That meant countless women entered adulthood believing their forgetfulness, disorganization, and overwhelm were personal failings. Many were only diagnosed after their children were, suddenly realizing they'd been struggling with the same thing for 40 years. Cultural sexism amplified it. Women are expected to be organized, nurturing, and endlessly multitasking. ADHD made those expectations brutal, and instead of being diagnosed, women were just labeled flaky. So yeah, ADHD wasn't invisible in women, society just refused to see it. Which makes you wonder how many other truths about ADHD are still being buried. Number 6. The productivity scam. Here's the dirty secret. ADHD isn't actually worse now than it used to be. It just looks worse because we live in a culture that worships productivity like it's a religion. Think about it. In a world that measures human worth and output per hour, of course ADHD feels catastrophic. Miss a deadline? Lazy. Forget to answer an email? Irresponsible. Struggle to stay focused in a 3-hour meeting that could have been an email? Clearly defective. The myth is that ADHD suddenly became more common. The reality is that society became less forgiving. Late-stage capitalism thrives on efficiency, squeezing more from less. The hustle culture narrative tells you that every second wasted is a failure. But ADHD brains are wired for bursts of hyperfocus and long stretches of wandering. Research shows ADHD adults often excel in creative problem-solving, divergent thinking, and crisis response. But none of that matters if the metric is how well you can grind through spreadsheets at 2 p.m. What we call symptoms are really incompatibilities between human neurodiversity and a culture obsessed with optimization. ADHD isn't the problem, the cult of productivity is. So maybe the issue isn't your focus, maybe it's the measuring stick. And speaking of measuring, let's talk about the one tool that got demonized the most. Number 5. The medication stigma. Remember the Ritalin panic of the 90s? The headline screamed, "Over-medicated kids, pills instead of parenting." Turns out, that media storm did more damage to adults with ADHD than anyone admits. If you grew up during that era, you probably absorbed the message. ADHD meds are dangerous, overprescribed, or just legalized speed. That stigma didn't fade when you became an adult. Instead, it left entire generations wary of treatment that actually works. So millions of adults struggled silently, convinced that taking medication was shameful or weak. The truth is, stimulant medication is one of the most researched psychiatric treatments in history, with decades of data showing effectiveness in improving focus, working memory, and task initiation. But thanks to moral panic, many adults never even considered it. Some still believe it's a shortcut instead of a medical tool. Meanwhile, untreated ADHD increases risk for depression, job loss, and even accidents. The irony? by trying to avoid the label or the crutch, adults ended up carrying a far heavier burden. Cultural fear replaced actual science, and ADHD adults paid the price. So if the cure was demonized, what happens when the culture also convinced you the disorder itself would magically disappear? Number 4. The outgrow it myth. Here's a comforting lie adults were told, don't worry, kids just grow out of ADHD. Spoiler, they don't. For decades, doctors and teachers reassured parents that ADHD was just a childhood phase. The narrative was simple: a little extra energy, some forgetfulness, but nothing permanent. By adulthood, it would magically disappear, and if you didn't grow out of it, well, then clearly you were just failing at adulthood. That's a heavy script to carry into your 30s, 40s, or 50s. Long-term studies, like the multimodal treatment study of children with ADHD, show that 60–70% of kids with ADHD still experience significant symptoms as adults. The hyperactivity might fade into restlessness, but the executive dysfunction doesn't vanish. Adults still struggle with organization, focus, and impulsivity, only now without support. Imagine being told as a child that your struggles will disappear, then waking up at 40 realizing they haven't, and thinking the failure must be yours. That's not just a myth. It's cultural gaslighting, leaving adults doubly burdened with symptoms and shame. So no, you didn't fail to grow up. You were handed a broken promise. And while society blamed your brain, it found a convenient new scapegoat: technology. Number 3. The tech scapegoat. Quick question. If ADHD is caused by smartphones, how do we explain all the kids diagnosed in the 1970s, or, for that matter, in the 1800s? Every time you hear TikTok ruined attention spans or phones caused ADHD, you're hearing a cultural scapegoat. Sure, screens amplify distraction, but ADHD existed long before iPhones. In fact, early medical descriptions of attention disorders date back over a century. The lie is that ADHD is new, a modern invention. The truth is, technology just made it impossible to ignore. Historical records from 1902 by Dr. George Still describe children with impulsivity, forgetfulness, and difficulty sustaining effort. Basically, ADHD without the label. The difference today is that we have constant digital stimulation highlighting those struggles. Smartphones didn't create ADHD, they just exposed it in real time, every day on glowing screens we can't put down. Blaming tech is convenient because it shifts attention away from bigger systemic issues, like rigid work environments and cultural expectations of 24/7 focus. It's not that ADHD adults suddenly broke, it's that the spotlight on distraction got brighter. So no, your phone didn't give you ADHD. But the shame spiral society built around distraction? That's where the real damage lives. Number 2. The shame spiral. Here's the cruel part. ADHD isn't just about distraction. It's about the shame that comes after. Missed deadlines, forgotten birthdays, unopened bills. Each one feels like proof that you're broken. From childhood, the message is relentless. Try harder. Focus more. Stop being careless. Every mistake gets stacked into a story of failure. By adulthood, you're not just battling symptoms. You're battling the belief that you're lazy, selfish, or incapable. This shame spiral is so ingrained, most adults don't even question it. Psychological studies show that ADHD adults report significantly lower self-esteem, not just because of symptoms, but because of cultural narratives. Internalized stigma is like an invisible tax on every action. You hesitate to start tasks because you expect to fail. Shame doesn't motivate, it paralyzes. And yet, the dominant cultural script still insists ADHD adults should just push through. It's like telling someone with asthma to run harder. Shame isn't a solution, it's gasoline on the fire. Breaking free requires reframing. The problem isn't effort, it's fit. The mismatch between your wiring and society's demands, not your worth. So the shame spiral isn't proof you're broken, it's proof society taught you the wrong story, which leads us to the biggest truth of all. Number 1. The real story. What if ADHD isn't a flaw at all, but a mismatch? Not broken brains, just brains wired for a world that no longer exists. Think about it. In hunter-gatherer societies, what traits thrived? Constant scanning for novelty, rapid shifting of attention, bursts of energy and creativity. The very things labeled disorderly today were once survival skills. So maybe the real issue isn't ADHD itself, it's the systems we built around it. The neurodiversity movement reframes ADHD as part of the natural spectrum of human minds. Anthropological evidence suggests our ancestors benefited from a mix of attention styles, some steady, some restless. Modern culture, however, prizes one mode: sit still, grind endlessly, obey the clock. Adults with ADHD aren't failing, they're colliding with rigid systems built for conformity. Studies show ADHD adults excel in crisis, innovation, and creative industries when allowed flexibility. The so-called disorder is only disabling because we force every brain to the same industrial funnel. The real story isn't laziness or moral failure, it's cultural mismatch. So, no, ADHD adults aren't broken, the culture is. And that realization might just change how you see your entire life story. Here's the punchline. ADHD was never your personal flaw. It was a story written by outdated science, industrial schedules, gender bias, moral panic, and cultural shame. Every myth you carried was really a system-level lie. The truth? Your brain isn't defective, it's diverse. Send this to someone who still thinks ADHD is about laziness. They deserve the real story, too.